Hello, we are Group 11 and we have chosen to analyze domestic violence with the Discourse approach. And our starting point was a shocking event that took place in Brisbane on 19th of February 2020 when Rowan Baxton doused his 3 children and wife, Hannah Clark, in petrol and set them on fire while they were locked in the car. This was the end of a long domestic violence story. The very next day, during a press conference, Detective Inspector Mark Thompson made a controversial statement, letting him to be removed from the investigation. Here's the video.
Is murder-suicide the only line of inquiry currently?
Absolutely not. Our job as investigators is to keep a completely open mind. We need to look at every piece of information and to put it bluntly, there are probably people out there in the community that are deciding which side, so to speak, to take in this investigation. Is this an issue of a woman suffering significant domestic violence and her and her children perishing at the hands of the husband, or is this an instance of a husband being driven too far by issues that he suffered by certain circumstances into committing acts of this form?
With this in mind, we will talk about domestic violence and the discourse communities that are part of this discourse. Domestic violence can be defined as a pattern of behaviors used by one person to maintain power and control over another partner, which can be presented in many different ways, as well as just threatening to abuse. There are multiple discourse communities within domestic violence, and as we have learned during the course, discourse community can be defined as a group of people who share values, goals, and beliefs. They have particular ways of communicating with each other. They have their own genre. They share activities and develop ways of getting things done. They have their own specialized terminology and vocabulary and high-level expertise in a particular area. We drew up one version of a discourse community map, and when it comes to domestic violence discourse communities, they share common goals, intercommunicate amongst their members, they share information and feedback, they have specialized terminology and vocabulary, and they share their expert knowledge in the particular theme. Since we referred to the Detective Thompson statement, we will focus on the 3 discourse communities highlighted in the video: the media, the police, and the victim related to domestic violence, including the different ideologies and their specific terminology. Michele will now talk about the media discourse community. Thank you.
Thank you, Maite. The media discourse community aims to entertain, inform, educate, and ultimately influence its audience through channels like the newspapers, broadcasting, and the internet. As a discourse community, the media offers an interesting perspective because, unlike other communities, it actually operates under 2 sets of parameters. On the one hand, like any discourse community, it constructs its own ideology and shares that with the public. But on the other, because the media relies on its audience to exist through readership, it actually borrows terminology from that audience to connect with it. And in that sense, it really operates as a reflector of societal beliefs and attitudes. So bringing those 2 functions together, and whether that's through lexical choice, news writing strategies, or even deciding what is newsworthy, how does the media construct or represent domestic violence? Media representation of domestic violence has experienced a small but significant shift in recent years. Historically, domestic violence was reported as a single event, often presented in a very simplistic and insubstantial way, which completely fails to acknowledge the prolonged abuse endured by the victim, and also grossly misrepresented the heinous nature of the crime. Today, media coverage increasingly mentions pre-existing harm. Perpetrators are clearly labelled, and there is reference to relevant helplines like 1-800-RESPECT, which has become common practice. So that was definitely prevalent in the Hannah Clark murders and shows that domestic violence today is finally recognised as a social problem which requires a community-wide effort. That said, incidents are still often sensationalised by typically limiting coverage to extreme cases of domestic violence, like the Hannah Clark murders, which implies that the more subtle and insidious forms of abuse, like emotional, verbal, spiritual abuse, are not just yet or not quite yet recognised as such. Victim blaming is also still underlying through reporting statements like, well, he was driven to kill, implying that Hannah Clark may have driven him to kill. And too often, the media still contributes to diminishing the perpetrator's visibility and responsibility by either foregrounding or backgrounding information. For example, using a passive sentence construction shifts the action from the perpetrator to the victim, and by doing so removes the perpetrator from the sentence and from the scene. So in the case of Hannah Clark murders, headline said, "Mother of three set alight in a suburban street of Brisbane." Now, who set them alight, and where is Rowan Clark in all of this? Ultimately, the ideology that underpins the media discourse community has evolved from one that used to be dispassionate to one that advocates change and has started to report incidents like the Hannah Clark murders within the context of domestic violence. But certain lexical choices and reference to media frames like sensationalism, victim blaming suggest that the underlying ideology is still very much a patriarchal one. Now, this is important because the media as a means of mass communication has the ability to influence and shape our perception of the world and potentially could become a driver for social change. So we want to get it right. And whilst media representation has evolved, it still falls short. Thank you.
As Michele pointed out, victim blaming and blame shifting are still very connected to the domestic violence discourse. The videos chosen from this discussion clearly shows this, and it also highlights the key role the police play in domestic violence. The police are at the forefront of domestic violence. Every 2 minutes, police are called out to a domestic violence incident. Every time the police attend a DV, as they refer to for a domestic violence call, they may take someone into custody, lay charges, organize protection orders. They're also required to prepare reports, statements, and even appear in court. So you can imagine how busy the police are with domestic violence incidents. Unfortunately, around Australia, police are overwhelmed by the amount of DV calls they have to attend. Nevertheless, they do take DV very seriously, and their first priority is the safety of the people involved. As a discourse community, they are the first ones on the scene, and they see themselves as the protectors. As one victim recalls the police saying during a DV call, "We can't let this man back into your house. He cannot protect yourself, so we have to." As a discourse community, their purpose is to enforce the law, protect victims of domestic violence, seek justice for these victims, stop the perpetrators, and make sure that they take responsibility for their actions. As a discourse community, they share very specific lexes. They speak of interim intervention order, a short-term order given by a magistrate to protect victims immediately. DVO, police protection notice, an order to stop perpetrators from committing domestic violence. PINOP, person in need of protection, and many of these specific lexes shown here in this slide. And although their main purpose is to protect victims, they still have a very patriarchal ideology. Returning to the video of Inspector Thompson, his comment, "Is this an issue of a woman suffering significant domestic violence, or is this an instance of a husband being driven too far into committing acts of this form?" clearly shows this paternalistic view. In his comment, he's shifting the focus from a clear case of domestic violence to one of victim blaming, that the victim must have done something to push the perpetrator to commit such crime. And perpetrators themselves believe this view and feel that their abuse is justified. There's no excuse for victim blaming behavior. We might try to understand the inspector's comment within the context of the amount of DV calls the police have to attend. However, the reality is that the police are part of a hyper-masculine environment, and police culture continues to be a serious issue. Despite positive changes in policies and protocols, victim blaming continues to happen because cultural change is one of the most difficult things to effect. Nonetheless, it's important to try to change this patriarchal ideology because the way police respond to the domestic violence has huge implications for victim safety. I leave you with a statement from Judith Herman, author of the book Trauma and Recovery. "The legal system is designed to protect men from the superior power of the state, but not to protect women or children from the superior power of men." Thank you very much.
DV experts have stated that police around Australia are failing domestic violence victims as the policies developed to help victims aren't being properly policed. Furthermore, statistics will show that even once a woman has reported the violence, the procedures to ensure that the violence doesn't escalate are not followed. Due to reasons such as these, victims will turn to support groups for help. And once they reach out, they begin to understand what has been happening to them and hear, sometimes for the first time, the specific lexis used to describe it. This discourse community is often the most safest and most supportive place for victims to go to seek help. It aims to provide practical and emotional support to victims and includes a wide variety of referral services. The lexis of this discourse community is particularly powerful, as for many it's the first time that a word or label has been given to describe what they've been experiencing. And this is especially so for those experiencing violence that isn't physical, as hearing definitions for their abuse and knowing the terminology gives power back to the victims. Hannah Clark's brother said in his interview to A Current Affair, "Even Hannah for a few years said to me that she wasn't thinking that was abuse because he never hit me." This misconception that domestic violence is merely physical may be intrinsically tied to the use of the word violence. It has been suggested that the most appropriate terminology should be domestic abuse, as the word violence leads to assumptions that physical assault needs to have occurred for abuse to be constituted. Another term being used more and more frequently is family violence, as it allows coverage of abuse between a variety of different intimate relationships. Once a victim can identify the abuse through the specific lexis, this understanding can help them to work towards gaining control over their lives. First disclosure is the name used in this discourse community when a victim does speak up for the first time. Some other examples of lexis used in this discourse community are love bombing, the practice of showering a person with excessive affection to gain control after an abusive act; gaslighting, a term coined in the 1940s which is used to describe manipulation by psychological means into doubting one's own sanity. This particular lexis of gaslighting has gained a lot more popularity in recent years. Coercive control and intimate terrorism. These are used words to describe a system of behaviours used to dominate and control victims. Now, although domestic violence is non-gender specific, statistics will show that women historically and currently are at a much greater risk of suffering from domestic violence. Driven by feminist movements over time, women have been able to enact change in social policies and public perceptions. And arising from this feminist ideology, this discourse community helps to educate victims on the abuse that they're suffering by not only providing practical and emotional support to the victims, but also helping advocate for their rights by working on changes to the types of lexis used to describe their abuse, working hard to stop victim blaming, fighting for greater visibility of the victims and more accountability of those in charge and more consequences for the perpetrators themselves. Thank you.
We have seen that translating and interpreting is a communication activity that deals with texts, which are live, ever-evolving social products. They can be understood differently by different people, and they will never be ideology or bias-free. As translators and interpreters, our job is ultimately to get the message across as best as possible. And to do that, we have to constantly make decisions and solve problems. This is why it is important to understand our source and target discourse communities and ideologies so that we are better equipped to tackle these linguistic challenges. Let's look into some examples of what these problems can be in this context of domestic violence. Going back to one of our first slides, you will see the screenshots of videos produced in France in various languages to provide information to women suffering domestic violence in France during COVID. We noticed that each country may have a slightly different convention on how to call domestic violence. For example, in Spain, it's more commonly referred as gender violence. In France, spouse violence. In this case, interestingly, in Mandarin and English, they chose to omit the word victim and replaced by experiencing or suffering domestic violence. You will also see specific terminology of the discourse communities we talked about today. As a translator, you will have time to reflect and research the best options for these words, for example, in your target language. But as an interpreter, you will need to think on your feet and be prepared. Certain words or expressions might not even exist in your target language, so you must understand them in their context to be able to come up with a strategy to solve this problem. And linguistic challenges are often heightened by the fact that interpreting in domestic violence settings comes with a series of further complexities that go beyond terminology. For example, you might find yourself interpreting between a victim and a police officer, which are two different discourse communities, as we've seen. You may experience interpersonal challenges in interpreting for victims recounting very traumatic events. You may feel ethically challenged, as you might want to help the victim or feel annoyed at certain injustices. But the role an interpreter plays in this setting is fundamental, especially when so many women victims of domestic violence come from culturally diverse backgrounds. The lack of suitable interpreters is a barrier to victims engaging in the law and justice systems. If victims don't trust interpreters, they might omit important things or never report again. And this can obviously have devastating consequences. It can also prevent the police from actually understanding the situation and missing out on clues that they are trained to observe, ultimately preventing them from helping the victim or catching the perpetrator. I hope that these examples have highlighted the importance of understanding the domestic violence ideologies and discourse communities for interpreters and translators, so that we can be better prepared to perform our work and facilitate communication in this setting. Thanks for listening, and I will hand over to Norma now to wrap up and give you the key points we presented today.
Thank you, Juliana, for that great insight. So what have we covered today? We all know that domestic violence is a key topic in today's society. Our analysis shows there are multiple discourse communities related to domestic violence, of which we have specifically covered media, police, and victim support groups. Within these groups, we have highlighted that there is specific language conventions or lexis which may be more familiar to those within that community. We, as translators and interpreters, must be conscious of different conventions and lexis which is familiar in these communities before trying to convey meaning from the source language. Specifically, there are two issues. We can't interpret or translate a word we do not know. In addition, a word in one community may not be understood in another community. Overall, an improved understanding of terminology within the community through research will assist translators and interpreters in being able to convey meaning. Now, onto ideology. We have seen that different communities may have different ideologies. We saw the police. They have a patriarchal view, one which shifts the blame. On the other side, we have victim support groups. They represent female empowerment through education and driving change through conversation. Somewhere in between there is the media. Now you might ask, why do different groups have different ideologies? Well, that's because they interact with the topic differently. A victim will have a different perspective on domestic violence than a policeman. The existence of different ideologies is important for us to understand as translators and interpreters. We need to understand elements such as context and social implications from our potential client base in order to work out how best to convey meaning to our target audience. In the end, translators and interpreters will have to balance the need to be faithful to the source text versus conveying an appropriate meaning to our audience. I conclude with suggesting that we have only touched the surface of understanding discourse communities within domestic violence. But this presentation in itself, through our analysis of Hannah Clark's murder, will help viewers within this presentation to understand the topic of domestic violence. This will place us as a community of translators and interpreters to better perform our services on the topic of domestic violence. Thank you.